Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and today we will be doing something that has been a long time in the making. It's something that, I'm going to tell you a little story here, but I've been thinking about for some time, and that is why certain cards don't seem to get nerfed despite having quite a few hallmarks of cards that you think should be nerfed. And I've got up here one of, I think, the best examples, and that is Mystic Shot. And I first started thinking about this back in, it was a long time ago. It was probably about when Bilgewater was about to be released, and you know, there was some thread about cards that needed to be nerfed or whatever, and someone commented on this Reddit thread, Mystic Shot. And people were very quick to say, no, Mystic Shot's fine, what are you talking about, blah, 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 all that, you know, why would you want to nerf Mystic Shot? And it got me thinking, because I agreed with them, no, Mystic Shot doesn't need a nerf, of course it doesn't, that would be ridiculous. But then I started thinking about it a little more, that Mystic Shot is a very strong card, everyone knows it's a very strong card, and it sees a lot of play, because it is a strong card, and therefore has quite a few hallmarks of cards that maybe are deserving of nerfs, but at the same time I thought, I don't want this card to be nerfed. Why? This would be a terrible nerf to the game. And it got me thinking, why do I think that? And I think for particularly newer players to card games, this is something that is quite important to sort of grasp at first. Because newer players to the game will see Mystic Shot, they'll see that it's played, you know, in almost every P and Z deck, and think, well, this is a really strong card that's seen in almost every P and Z deck. Surely it's worthy of a nerf. And we're going to get into why, you know, it shouldn't be nerfed, and also why, you know, people don't really call for a card like Mystic Shot to be nerfed. And we're going to go through each region and kind of maybe pick out a few cards that maybe fall under that category. You know, cards that everyone knows is strong. Everyone knows potentially that are really strong, but no one calls for them to get nerfed. And we're going to go through, you know, why that is, and also, as I mentioned, going through and sort of identifying as many of these different cards as we can. So, with that said, buckle up. This is, you know, you don't really have to watch what's going on the screen. I'm basically just going to do this where, you know, the card is just there for you. So you don't really have to watch, but you can listen and sort of see what you think, because I'm quite interested to hear what other people say about this, because in my mind, these cards very well all could be nerfed. I mean, Mystic Shot is kind of a hard card to nerf, I think. Like, you know, you either kill the card, maybe, or it's difficult to nerf, I think. But aside from that, buckle up. We're going to go through some of these cards. As I mentioned, you don't really have to listen. But let's start with I'm just going to go in alphabetical order of regions. Let's start with Bilgewater. So let's begin with Bilgewater. And we actually begin with a card that has seen a nerf. And I would say that nowadays probably doesn't represent Bilgewater as well as it once did. But for those of you who aren't aware, Make It Rain used to cost 2 mana. And Make It Rain used to be you know, if you were playing Bilgewater, you put in 3 Make It Rain. It was as simple as that. Because for 2 mana, the ability that it has is just, you know, it was a really strong ability. But why? And now we'll start, you know, sort of teasing out why potentially these cards, you know, either don't get nerfed, or, you know, it took them a while to nerf Make It Rain, I would say. People kind of understood that this was a really good card, and it kind of maybe took them an extra balance patch or so to sort of get around to nerfing it. But I think that that's because this card, and like all of the other cards in this video that I'm going to show, are representations of the region as a whole. These are cards that they want to be strong. These are cards that are saying, if this card does what we want the whole region to do, it represents it. And Make It Rain, I mean, you can look at the champions that came out in you know, the first Bilgewater patch, so everyone here but Tom Kench. And Make It Rain fits pretty much with all of them, except for Nautilus, who's kind of, you know, his own thing. But the other 4, Make It Rain is right there with them. It's a spell for Fizz that's kind of proactive. You know, you can kill a unit, give him elusive, maybe deal damage to the Nexus. It fits with Fizz. Misfortune, of course, it's her champion spell. So obviously it synergizes pretty well with her as well, because, you know, potentially you can, you know, surprise deal 2 to them if you use Make It Rain with Misfortune's ability as well. Twisted Fate, of course, his red card does a very similar thing to Make It Rain, so, you know, potentially you can deal 2 damage to all their units. combined. And Gangplank, of course, the kegs is kind of the main synergy point, where instead of dealing 1, it will deal 2 and potentially hit the Nexus as well. So Make It Rain represents a card, where is it? That synergized with pretty much the whole region. And therefore, it was a card that kind of, sort of they let slide a bit despite it being very powerful. Now, Make It Rain was powerful to the point and extent where it was a bit oppressive. If Make It Rain was still 2 mana, I can guarantee you that Discard Aggro would not be built in its current form, because anything with 1 health, it was kind of similar to Go Hard, where you couldn't play 1 health units because it just died to Make It Rain. So it was somewhat oppressive, so they did have to nerf it. It's also a champion spell, which, Misfortune's already a good champion, so that probably came into it as well. But it did get nerfed, whereas, most of the cards on this list haven't been nerfed. So what's replaced it then? If it's not Make It Rain, because we don't really see Make It Rain that much anymore, what card, and I'm talking non-champion cards here, of course, because the game is built around the champions, but obviously not every champion goes into every deck, because they're kind of, the whole point is you build around them. So what card would I now say Bilgewater's new exclusive card is, and that is Fortune Croaker. I think that this has become the sort of face of Bilgewater, if you will. It has the draw effect, which of course Bilgewater has, quite a lot of draw, whether it's from your opponent's deck or yours. That's kind of a big facet of it. It has a pretty mediocre body. Of course, it deals damage to itself, so therefore it becomes a 2/2. So, not very a strong unit per se. And then it also has to deal 1 to another ally as well. So you have to have another ally on the board. So it's kind of like a slower conditional draw effect that, comes with some negatives to it. But that represents Bilgewater and a weaker body as well. That is kind of a lot of different Bilgewater things coming together, and Fortune Croaker sees a lot of play. I would say that it, again, is a card that kind of represents Bilgewater at the moment the best. But if you notice, we all know it's a strong card. We all know it sees a lot of play in a lot of different decks. I don't think I've seen that many people call for a nerf to Fortune Croaker. It definitely isn't on the sort of top priority of a lot of people. And you'll see this a lot with all of these cards that I'll mention. You'll probably realize, yeah, that is a really strong card. Why hasn't that been discussed for nerfs? And I think it's just so interesting that we kind of accept that, oh, this card synergizes really well with what the whole region is doing. Therefore, it's okay to be strong. It's okay to be a ubiquitous card seen across the region. And we're going to dive into that at the end and whether these cards should be nerfed or not. But, for now, we're just going to highlight the different cards that I think it is. And I think my representative for Bilgewater at the moment would be Fortune Croaker. Moving on to Demacia. And I know a lot of you might be thinking, is he going to say Grand Plaza? Is he going to bring up Plaza? And I'm not going to bring up Plaza because, of course, it's a card that people desperately want to see nerfed, and I think almost certainly will be in the next balance patch. I'd be very surprised if it wasn't. And I don't think it is the most ubiquitous. In fact, I think we can go back all the way to the open beta to find the card that I would say is the sort of the card that conjures in my mind, maybe apart from the champions first, and that is Single Combat. Single Combat, since, I played the game from, pretty much when the open beta first came out, maybe a week after it came out. And Single Combat has been a 3-of in Demacia decks for a long, long time. Now, it's not played in every single Demacia deck. If you're playing like an aggressive Demacia deck, you might not put Single Combat in it. But aside from, the most aggressive Demacia decks, it really is seen in pretty much every other one as a 3-of. Because, of course, it's a strong card that potentially can remove an opponent. It can, pseudo-deny an opponent's spell. And, it's just a very, very good card. And again, you might think, you've never seen someone call for a nerf on Single Combat, despite it being played in almost all Demacia decks for the entirety of the game, right? And so, what's going on? Again, it's that same thing of Single Combat just represents the region very, very well. It's about being combat-based. It doesn't feel oppressive. Nothing gets oppressed by Single Combat. I think that's another sort of important point, and that's why, you know, a card like Make It Rain did get nerfed, whereas something like Single Combat didn't, is because Single Combat doesn't, you know, single-handedly, if you will, put down entire archetypes, right? And that's something that, you know, game balance has to think about, and, you know, having a healthy game, you know, you don't want cards that just completely destroy entire archetypes or, you know, ideas. And Single Combat isn't one of those, and so it's been allowed to flourish here, sitting there at this 2 mana, fast speed, really good card. And again, this is, you know, we're just gonna talk about and identify these different cards in these regions, just to hopefully, you know, get you thinking about, like, oh yeah, I've never seen anyone call for a nerf to Single Combat, but the play rate on Single Combat is really high. And just to make you think, you know, about should any of these cards get nerfed, and we'll come to that at the very end. So on to Freljord, and Freljord I think is much tougher. When you look at the Freljord cards, you know, the non-champion cards, Omen Hawk is a consideration, but Omen Hawk I think is just kind of it's kind of its own thing, you know. It doesn't really synergize with the region. It's not doing what the region does as a whole. It's just kind of a decent card. And aside from that, you know, there isn't too many options, but I think this is the option I will go for in Troll Chant. Again, a card that you see a lot of, and again, played in pretty much every Freljord deck. I mean, as soon as this card started being played in Feel the Rush decks, you know, that's kind of what pushed me over the edge. Like, even in the most, you know, control-y of control matchups where your aim goal is to get a bunch of 10/10s on the board, Troll Chant still sees play. That to me kind of says, okay, this is the card over something like Omen Hawk, where, you know, Omen Hawk wouldn't see play in that deck. And here it is. And it does do quite a few things that Freljord does, of course. It gives you health. And, you know, the Freljord cards tend to be, you know, decently statted cards, and it wants to keep them alive. You know, obviously it's similar to Elixir of Iron in that way, and gives enemy less attack. So again, kind of combat focused, but can be used elsewhere. You know, a decent option in a lot of different decks, of course, as it has been played in a lot of different decks. The negative attack, you know, similar to Frostbite, you know, not exactly the same, but a similar sort of thing that, of course, again, is another big Freljord sort of mechanic. And yeah, just a very strong card again. But it fits very well within this category, because I'm not sure. I mean, I think I've been kind of on this train that Troll Chant maybe needs to see enough, but outside of myself, you know, on Reddit, on Twitter, whatever, you don't really see a lot of people complaining about Troll Chant, despite it being a very strong card that, you know, will see play in almost every Freljord deck under the sun. So, again, something to think about. Does Troll Chant need enough? On we go to the next region. So on to Ionia, and I know everyone and their mother thought that this would be the card that I would think of. Deny, right? Like, if you asked someone to name Ionian cards, you know, they might come out with a couple champions first, but then the first non-champion that everyone will say, I'm fairly sure, would be Deny. It strikes up the image of Ionia in your head, very much so, and within Ionia decks, this is pretty much a main reason why you play Ionia in the first place, is for Deny. But I don't actually think that this is the card that I'm going to pick for this region, and that is because it has seen a nerf. For those of you who aren't aware, Deny used to be 3 mana, and, you know, Deny is still really good at 4 mana, so you can only imagine how utterly absurd it was at 3 mana, which it was. And it is still a decent candidate, which is why I bring it up, because at the time, you know, a lot of people were calling for Deny to be nerfed, but a lot of people still pushed back. And you might think that that's crazy, because, you know, some people might even think Deny needs nerfing now, but at 3 mana, when it was a lot better, people still thought, don't nerf Deny, because they thought it was a core to the region, and, you know, you can't do this to Ionia. And you could argue that, you know, a big problem of Ionia's lack of play rate in different decks, I know we see it with Lee Sin, Targon, but outside of that, there isn't much Ionia going around, is that Deny and then probably what became their next most signature spell in Will of Ionia, both got nerfed. And that left the region, you know, when your best cards both get nerfed, and, you know, the up in mana increase, you know, Will hasn't seen the sort of survivability that maybe Deny has. It left a big gap in the region. But I actually think that a different card has become the new face, and that is Eye of the Dragon. Because Eye of the Dragon to me is everything that I kind of I'm fitting into this category. It represents the region very well. It's spell-based, which of course a lot of Ionia is. It gives you lifesteal, which Ionia has quite you know, a few decent options for. It's not a big body, you know, a 1/3 on its own. It helps you cast those spells with a tune as well, and it's played in a lot of decks for Ionia. It's a very, very good 2-drop, and again, you don't really see people calling for a nerf to Eye of the Dragon. And that's kind of what I'm going for here. You know, the card, no calls for a nerf really, but still very strong and still sees a lot of play. Eye of the Dragon is ticking all of the boxes. And again, I think if you said to people, hey, we're going to nerf Eye of the Dragon, a lot of people would push back on you and say, no, don't do that. You know, mainly probably because right now Ionia would then be left with very, very few options and reasons to play. But Eye of the Dragon is a very strong card, and I mean, I know a lot of people complain about Lee Sin Targon, but if you took Eye of the Dragon and nerfed that, that would be a suitable nerf to the deck, and would leave you, you know, without many options. And maybe they will go down that route simply because that would be a way of nerfing that deck, but we'll see. I think we shall see. But I think people might be a bit upset, and if this card does get nerfed, I bet there'll be some reactions to it of, that was a mistake, they shouldn't have done that. Because I think, again, this falls within this category of people, you know, like to have these cards that are kind of, you know, strong focal points of a region. So now we come to Targon, you know, the most recent addition to the game, and Targon to me has a choice of two, and both, I think, are on people's radar a little more than perhaps the others. But let's start with Pale Cascade. Pale Cascade is a card that, since Targon came out, pretty much on, I would say, the second day, people figured out this is a really strong card, and started putting it as a 3-of in every single Targon deck. And people have called for nerfs on this card. People have said, you know, myself included, a lot of people have been saying this card needs to be nerfed. Why has this card not been nerfed, etc., etc. And they've always pushed back. And I'm pretty sure there's even a quote out there somewhere from the balance team about, you know, regions having strong cards and Pale being that card for Targon. And, you know, I mean, this is what basically the whole video is about, right? Certain regions having strong cards, and we've kind of brought some of them up. But Targon has, you know, kind of got two of them, and we're going to get into the other one as well. And neither, I mean, yeah, we'll talk about the other one when we come to it. But let's talk about Pale. Pale is above most of the cards, but it represents, you know, it has Nightfall, which is obviously a pretty big part of Targon, particularly with Aphelios coming out as well. It has, you know, a combat trick, which Targon is kind of full of. I mean, you know, like gems are kind of combat tricks. Like, they're not combat tricks, but, you know, they're sort of unit stats based tricks, you know, which Targon is kind of full of. And it has a draw, which, you know, Targon has a bit of, but Pale probably being their best option for that. So will Pale get nerfed? Maybe. It's in the works, but you can see straight away just how much they've pushed back on touching Pale. Sort of suggests to me that they wanted this to be, you know, a strong effect within Targon and sort of represent Targon as a whole. And the other card that we have to come to, of course, is Hush. Now, this one is interesting because Hush, does it fall into the oppressive category? It's teetering on the edge. I think Hush, again, and the same as Pale, very high play rates, very strong cards. They have already changed Hush once, of course. I think what most people feel with Hush is that it's just not fun. Hush just isn't a fun card to really either play or play against. It can win you games, and you won't feel that great about winning it. It will do certain things that other cards simply cannot do, you know, affecting champions in the way it does for 2 mana. And it's just a card that I think frustrates a lot of people. But it has become a face of Targon. Again, if you ask people to name Targon cards that weren't champions, I think Hush would probably be the first one that came to people's minds. Because, you know, the silencing of things is clearly what they wanted Targon to kind of, you know, they kind of push them in that. That's the kind of a Targon thing, more so than with other regions. Will Hush get nerfed? And this is my whole point with this video. Probably more likely than Pale. I think because people, it's unfun to play against, whereas Pale is just kind of just strong, right? Whereas I think Hush kind of, you know, takes the biscuit for just being a bit unfun. And, you know, they've already changed Hush once. So I think we can probably say that Pale is the true sort of Targon face. But Hush, unfortunately, perhaps, has become sort of a secondary face as well. On to Noxus, and I think that this one is quite easy. And again, this to me is another great representation of a card that everyone knows is super, super, super strong, but you don't really hear people, you know, calling for nerfs. And this one is more obvious than most, because there are other things that deal 4 to a unit that cost 2 more mana and are harder to get the requirement for. And obviously we're talking about Flock, a card that is just very, very strong. And despite other cards dealing 4 to units, they sometimes have harder, you know, conditions to achieve, maybe like Black Spear, and also cost 2 more mana. So I think Flock is a card that if it existed at 2 mana would still be a very good card. But again, you don't see people calling for a nerf on Flock, and I think I would be surprised if it did get nerfed. Because again, it does a lot of what Noxus is about. You know, it is to do with units being stunned or damaged, both of which are kind of, you know, Noxus staples, and it has a very powerful removal effect with a condition. That's kind of Noxus's thing, right? Like, they have very strong sort of cheap removal if you can achieve a certain condition. For instance, Culling Strike, of course, is, you know, your best option against anything with 3 or less power. It's just really good. You know, it's the best card you're going to find, for instance, for those cards. Assuming that they have, you know, more than like 1 or 2 health. Scorched Earth is probably your best answer to any landmarks, right? Like cheap, good removal for, you know, specific things. That's the whole point, right? And so Flock represents that pretty well in a spell for what Noxus is doing as a whole. And again, it's that same thing. You don't see people calling for it nerfed. I would be very surprised if the card did get nerfed. But at the same time, we all know that Flock is way better than like the other options. And, you know, this is the thing where, you know, you have difference between regions. You know, not every region should have the same thing. Well, this is Noxus's good thing. I stand for Noxus. This is their card, right? And again, these cards are kind of in their own category of don't touch these unless you have to kind of thing. And that's where I think Flock is for Noxus. Now, PNC, we've already mentioned Mystic Shot, which I think does very well, you know, define the region. It's a versatile option that doesn't deal with big things, but in the early game can be very strong. You know, it can go face. It's basically cheap, you know, kind of weak effect, but versatile as well. That's kind of PNZ as a whole, if you think, because, you know, PNZ struggles to deal with bigger things, but small things it can deal with very efficiently and effectively. So that, to me, is Mystic Shot, and it represents the region very well. But I also wanted to talk about another card, because I think it also is representing PNZ quite well, and again, is a very strong card that you don't see a lot of people calling for nerfs, and that is Ballistic Bot. Ballistic Bot, we all know, is a very, very good card, but again, it represents PNZ very well. It creates a card for you, which of course is a big PNZ thing. It gives you a discard target, again, a very PNZ thing. It can go face, and deal burn damage to the opponent, again, a very PNZ thing. It comes on, what at first is a very mediocre body in a 1/3, but then has the potential to grow and become a strong body later on. To me, this card is a lot of what PNZ is trying to do, and fits, again, within many, many different PNZ decks for that reason. And so, will Ballistic Bot see a nerf? Again, you don't see many people calling for it. It, I think, would be somewhat warranted if it did, because it's such a strong card. But I would be surprised if they did, because I think you can put Ballistic Bot in that category of, this is a card we want it to be strong, and we know it's strong, and it represents the region very well, so we're just going to put it in that box and don't touch it, again, unless something crazy comes up, and, we find that it's outperforming every card to a ridiculous level, right? And finally, we come to SI, and again, we can go back right to the start of Open Beta, and this card, Glimpse Beyond. Just very simple idea, very, very simple idea, but has represented Shadow Isles very, very well. Hasn't always seen play in every single Shadow Isles deck, but has seen play in a lot of Shadow Isles decks, as I'm sure you're all aware. And just the simple idea of killing an ally to get some positive effect is sort of the most Shadow Isles thing that you can have, right? That's basically Shadow Isles in a nutshell, and Glimpse is a perfect representation of that card. And again, you never see anyone calling for a nerf to Glimpse. You will not see it, despite it being, again, a very sort of high played card and having a very strong effect, and therefore, in your logically, you could therefore say it needs to be nerfed, but again, because it represents the region so well, I think I'd be shocked. At this point, I would be absolutely stunned and shocked if this card got nerfed. And this one has a bit of an interesting backstory, because, again, for those of you who weren't playing in the open beta, or those that you were, you will remember that Shadow Isles kind of got nerfed heavily, because the Shadow Isles Allegiance deck that existed with Hecarim and Elise and a bunch of fearsomes was so good, and I mean ridiculously good, and they actually ended up nerfing Black Spear. If I can find Black Spear, they actually ended up nerfing Black Spear, which used to cost 2 mana and deal 3. It is now changed to 3 mana, and then they upped it to deal 4. But it used to be a 2 mana deal 3 if an ally died this round, and they nerfed this card, and the reaction was always, and the only reaction I remember from that time, was people saying, why did they nerf Black Spear? Glimpse was the one that needed a nerf. That is what people kept saying, Glimpse was the problem card, not Black Spear. Black Spear was like, fine conditional removal. Glimpse was this card that kept them going into the late game and allowed them a chance. But they didn't nerf Glimpse, and they didn't nerf Glimpse because they wanted Glimpse to represent the region, because it is the card of the region, and has stayed that way ever since, and is still a very, very good card. So with all of that said, with this sort of identifying of the different regions and their cards, for some regions it's much more clear, and I think in those regions, what you get is stronger decks. I think that's when a region turns from good to bad, and it's not always, because certain regions can have different cards, and particularly the champions can impact that as well. If a region has like 2 of the top 5 strongest champions, then that region often will just see a lot of play because of the good champions. So it's not always to do with the cards, but I think when regions sort of rise and fall, a big part of it can be because of how good their sort of core cards are in the region, and we've kind of gone through them. And so, will these cards ever get nerfed? Will any of these cards ever get changed? I think some of them could be. Hush, I think, would be the most obvious one, but you can look at quite a few of them and you can go, yeah, maybe they should get nerfed, maybe this card should get changed in some way, because it is played in every single deck, and I do just click a 3 of it straight away without thinking. I know that is the correct way to play. And do you want that in your game? And I think that the ultimate answer is that's what they want. They want certain cards to represent these regions, and so that you know what you're playing, you know what the idea is of that region, and that's how you can identify with the game, where you know, I'm playing this region, it has this strengths, it has this weaknesses, and this card says that. That's what this card is saying to me by playing it. I'm doing this, which is good, but if they can do this, then that's going to be bad for me, right? And so I don't expect many of these cards to be changed unless they become somewhat oppressive, and by that I mean they put down other archetypes and stop other things from ever being playable, because they see a lot of play, and therefore they're a very good counter to those things, which I'm not sure many of them are. And so even though a lot of these cards are some of the strongest cards in the game, I don't think you will really ever see them get nerfed, because they want certain things to represent the region, and they want certain things to be very good. And you can see it, as I mentioned before, with the power level of certain regions. I remember Noxus, particularly for open beta, was a struggling region. A region that, maybe if you were playing aggro decks, you could play. But then as soon as sort of Bilgewater came out, and, they got a new influx of cards with sort of Swain's package, all of a sudden the region started to make sense. And that's the simple impact of having, say, for instance, a Flock, which becomes a really powerful card. All of a sudden, you could play Noxus in non-aggro decks. Whereas before, you really probably couldn't, and we didn't see much of it. But all of a sudden, Flock made it make sense, because now with Flock, you had a very, very good removal tool that opened up a lot of different options. And that's the thing, whilst these cards are very strong, because a lot of them are quite flexible, which in part makes them very strong, it allows you more options. So that is a key reason why these cards won't see nerfs, or I would be surprised if they did, because their whole point is to open up the game, to give you a bunch of different ways to play, rather than think, well, this is an auto 3 of, therefore it should be nerfed, because everyone just puts it in their decks, right? So that's kind of the whole point. They identify with the region, they allow more options for that region rather than restricting opponents' options. That's kind of the idea. So don't expect any of these cards to see nerfs anytime soon. Hush and Pale is like an interesting one. Targon being the most recent addition to the game, it's probably, they're still fully fleshing out their ideas for the region. And with Aphelios, maybe we'll see even more of that come out. But with that said, thank you so much for watching. Please let me know what you think. Have I opened your mind to any of these cards? Did I miss any cards? I did have some more sort of written down as like maybes, but this video was going on a bit too long, so I thought let's just cut it off. And so yeah, thank you so much for watching. Have a really nice day, and yeah, please feel free to let me know what you think down below.